I remember the look on his face like it was carved into a stone I carry in my pocket, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. The room was full of flowers and smiles, laughter that hung on strings like paper lanterns, and in the middle of it all the groom's voice cut through like a winter wind. "You're worthless," he said, loud enough for half the hall to hear. Not a joke, not an accident. A sentence aimed like a dart meant to bruise. You don't expect to be humiliated in front of a church full of people who came to celebrate love. You expect blessings, awkward dancing, maybe an old aunt who won't stop fussing over the cake. You don't expect to feel every eye turned toward you like you're some curiosity in a zoo. But that night, with the chandeliers hiding their bulbs behind crystal, that word lodged in me. Worthless. Here's what you need to know about getting to my age. Words land differently. When you're young, insults bounce like rubber balls. When you've been around the block a few dozen times, words are like weather. Sometimes they storm, sometimes they're a calm that soothes your bones. That night it stormed. And not just because of what he said. It was the way he said it with a smug grin that suggested he'd rehearsed the cruelty, practiced the humiliation like a cheap trick. I didn't shout. That's not me. I didn't storm out. I stayed, sat down slowly, tasted the bitter aftertaste in my mouth, and watched my daughter, my baby girl, the one I'd carried on my shoulders, turn white and squeeze my hand so hard I thought I'd feel the imprint for days. She mouthed sorry like a prayer, but the man standing at the altar had already proven who he was. A man who thought tearing someone else down in public was the quickest way to show how big he felt. Later, they'd call him reckless, impulsive, immature. They'd call me old-fashioned, stubborn, unable to forgive. But none of those labels capture the slow churn inside a person when their dignity gets walked on. I could have forgiven him. I could have smiled and let that night be a story of misplaced arrogance. But I'm old enough to know that some moments are not only about one night. They reveal the future you might be raising your daughter into. They show you the kind of father-in-law your grandchildren might remember. And in that flash, between the sniffles, the forced smiles, my daughter's eyes like someone trying to hold back an ocean, I decided I would not let that erosion pass without response. Revenge isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always involve shouting matches or threats. Sometimes revenge is a slow stitch, and sometimes it's surgical, precise, and inevitable. I had time, yes, plenty of it, now that I'm 70. But I didn't want to wait. I didn't want him to get comfortable in cruelty. So I did what my life of small trades and careful investments taught me. I calculated, I watched, I planned quietly, without fanfare. I made a choice that night under the hush of wedding music. If he wanted to prove my worthlessness to the world, I would prove something else entirely. I would take away the thing he prized most, his career, his reputation, the life he used like armor. And I would do it in 72 hours. People laugh when I tell them 72 hours. That's impossible, they'll say, smiling like it's a challenge to fate. But you don't need to move mountains in that time. You need leverage, knowledge, and people who know how to nudge the right dominoes. I had the first two already. Years of quiet investments. Years of lending a hand to the right people. Friendships that don't show up on social media but are etched into the community. The third, assembling quiet help, wasn't hard when your life has been spent helping others without asking anyone to remember. The groom's name was Andrew Hale. He was 32, handsome in the narrow, sharp way modern men are trained to be. Tailored suits, trimmed beard, a smile that said, "I belong" in glossy photos. He worked in a field people treat with a mixture of fear and awe. Corporate PR and branding for tech startups that think disruption is holy. He'd climbed fast. I'd heard names attached to him, launches, rebrands, IPO buzz. He had contacts at the agency that wrote think pieces, friends at a boutique investor firm, a following that looked like admiration, and frankly, small fear. He used all that like a shield, and his bravado that night showed exactly how much he trusted that shield. I spent the rest of the reception holding my daughter's hand. I watched her laugh when everyone told the old anecdotes. I watched her smile through the pain when she had to look graceful in front of in-laws who didn't see the man behind the phrase he'd used. I watched the couple dance their first slow, careful dance. And when the band played the song my wife used to hum on rainy afternoons, memories hit me with the softness of pages turning. I thought of my girl's childhood, of scraped knees, science projects, the way she'd tell me secrets by pressing her forehead to mine. I thought of the strength it took for her to marry someone who would publicly humiliate her father. In the kitchen of my mind, I balanced one thing against another: love for my daughter, and the requirement that the world not let this man trample her father's dignity, as if it were some casual footnote. That same night, back in my study, I opened my ledger. Not the kind people keep on their phones, but a battered folder with names, small notes, and percentages, properties I owned quietly, accounts I'd opened for emergencies, a small portfolio of investments I never put on display. My life never needed show. I liked my quiet. But quiet does not mean powerless. There were mortgages under different company names, small leases, a trust that would pay dividends on schedules I had set up decades ago. One of those accounts, one particular loan servicing company, carried lines that could, if nudged properly, create ripples. What I didn't have that night was rage alone. I had a method. Over the years, I'd learned the patterns of the world Andrew lived in. PR executives breathe on rumors. Founders panic at whispers about embezzlement or legal trouble. Investors run when a founder's narrative shifts from glory to gray. He sold confidence for a living, and confidence shatters on the cliff of scandal. So the plan didn't need to be elaborate. It needed to be credible, devastating, and timed to not allow him the luxury of reaction, only of consequence. 72 hours meant no grandstanding. It meant careful exposure, a quiet hand on the right button, and then watching the machine do what machines love doing: respond to momentum and amplify it. The first move was simple and surgical. It involved someone Andrew trusted and a ledger that would be hard for him to deny. I spent an hour on the phone, calling in favors the way people use tissues, softly, matter of fact, and without fuss. Some calls were to people who owed me a kindness. Others were to the ones I'd helped when their old houses needed a fix, or they needed a small business loan with a friendly guarantor. The call that mattered most was to a woman named Claire Mitchell, an investigative reporter who used to live 3 doors down from me before she moved to the city to make a name. She owed me a garden gate once. I owed her a cup of coffee when her dog ran off in a storm. People talk about the news industry folding into itself, but there are reporters who still love being right more than being famous. Claire was one of them. When I told her in a simple voice that there was a story that would make Andrew's resume look like a stitched brochure, she said, "Meet me tomorrow morning. I'll bring my recorder." The second move was the ledger. Andrew, in his arrogance, had never scrubbed all his tracks. He'd built a veneer of legitimacy on a few shell transactions, a couple of invoice adjustments, a consultancy that paid into an account with a name that meant nothing to most. But names mean things if you connect them properly. I had one such connection, a small holding company tied to a set of mortgage payments on a property Andrew's agency had used as an office. It was the kind of paper that, when matched to a string of emails, shows intent, more than a mistake. Intent is a sinner in the world of PR. Intent is what the markets punish. By morning, Claire had arrived at my kitchen table with a notepad and a look of someone who smelled a story at breakfast. I handed her a small folder, copies of payments, public filings, a photo of a check made out to a name she hadn't heard before, but would later find online. She flipped through, barely looking up. "Are you sure?" she asked. "We need a smoking gun." "There's a gun," I said quietly. "It's not smoking yet, but it will." We set the first domino. Claire promised to run a small piece, no accusations, just a quiet question. How clean are the books behind the splashy rebrands? She would phrase it so that anyone Googling him would find a seed that would sprout under pressure. She asked about sources. I told her where to look, and she thanked me with that small squeeze of hands reporters give to those who give them something truly useful. Parallel to that, I called an old friend in municipal housing development, a man who'd once been annoyed with me about the red mailbox, but who still knew the pausing places inside banks where loans get special attention. He didn't do favors for strangers, but he did for those with a history of returning kindness. He would, in the next day, send an informal inquiry as to the status of a line of credit the agency had used. No accusations. Just a bureaucratic nudge that would prompt an auditor to glance and perhaps worry if they found irregularities. Paperwork makes the unsteady walk. Auditors make people nervous. Nervous founders confess to their boards, and boards panic investors. The ripple gets louder. I told no one else. My daughter knew I was upset, but she didn't know I would set a clock to watch a man's world collapse and then sit down to see how it falls. I didn't relish it like a child tasting candy. I did it like a gardener pruning a diseased limb to protect the rest of the tree. The first day passed with the slowful patience of someone watching rain gather. Claire filed her piece in the morning feed, a soft paragraph on questions about bookkeeping and transparency. And a few hours later, an email from the bank asked for an explanation about an obscure account. Within 24 hours, his agency's clients had started to whisper. Within 36, a key investor had called to request a meeting. Within 48, Andrew got his first email from a partner with the sort of resigned tone that means goodbye is being considered. He paced his apartment like a tiger in a cramped cage. I could have sat back and let this be the end. Let the avalanche of small consequences wash him away. But 72 hours is a hard clock to meet. You can start something and hope it finishes itself, or you can make sure the final blow arrives clean and undeniable. So I triggered the last move. I had a friend in compliance at one of the bigger exchanges, a woman who could check a system in a way most people couldn't. She liked me because I'd once saved her mother from a leaky roof. She gave me a single line, a date, and a flag. It would take 2 calls to make authorities look at his contracts with a level of scrutiny that's not just polite curiosity, but full legal review. She told me she needed something that would move the timeline. I gave her the last piece, an invoice traced to one of those shell names, and a copy of a contract where he'd promised deliverables that never existed. At hour 67, I watched the alerts come in from my inbox, not with delight, but with a curious, slow satisfaction, the way one watches autumn leaves finally let go. The partner agencies began to issue statements, the firm froze a few accounts pending review, and the investors asked for emergency documentation. Andrew called my daughter twice at 2 a.m., voice raw, pleading for our understanding. She didn't answer. She had already seen the headlines. By hour 72, 2 things happened in quick succession. The board chair sent a terse email putting Andrew on immediate leave pending investigation, and a prominent columnist, one of those whose words cut deeper than corporate memos, penned an op-ed about ethics in modern PR, referring to recent events at a formerly admired agency. The world turned its head, and what had been a private cruelty became the public scalp of a man who had thought himself untouchable. When the dust settled, the papers called it scandal. The feeds called it a fall from grace. Friends called it karma. My daughter called it complicated, and then she called it finally over. I called it a lesson about dignity and about the cost of cruelty. I didn't celebrate in public. I walked to the kitchen and made tea. I sat with my hands warm around the cup and thought of my wife, of the quiet way she'd taught me to be patient. And I allowed myself a breath that felt like a small exhale after a long swim underwater. People asked later if I regretted it, if the deliberate dismantling of a career, the social ruin of a man, was something a father should do. I answer them the same way. I didn't set out to ruin a life for sport. I set out to protect mine and to make sure my child would not grow into a home where humiliation was allowed to hide behind charm. He had made a choice to be cruel on a day everyone remembered. I made a choice to make his career fragile in the same way he had made me feel fragile. The difference is this: I did not gloat. I made a place where accountability could take its course. That, in my mind, was justice, swift, precise, and necessary. The story winds out from there into a different kind of healing. There were apologies made, publicly, privately, and some that were never quite sincere. Andrew, when finally called to account, sent a terse note asking for privacy. His career limped on in new directions, but opportunities thinned. People who once queued to be seen with him had, after the headlines and the legal questions, other appointments to keep. My daughter, in the months after, learned how to build boundaries she had never known how to hold. She learned that love is not the same as endurance for humiliation. She rebuilt, and I watched her with a new kind of pride that didn't come from her achievements, but from how she reassembled herself, unbroken by a man who had tried to make her father small. Nothing about this was easy. There were nights when I woke replaying faces, Andrew's stunned expression on the altar, my daughter's shame, the whispers in the pews. There were mornings when doubt crept in and asked whether I'd been cruel to be wise. But then I'd remember the way he'd said, worthless, like it was a badge of honor, because he thought he'd stripped me of everything. I wasn't stripped. I was simply choosing what deserved my attention and what did not. And 72 hours was the span of a storm. After storms, you clear the debris. You plant again. You teach your children to do the same. If you ask me now, years later, if the method mattered, I'd tell you it's the lesson that did. That cruelty spoken in public does not exist in a vacuum. It ricochets. It instructs a generation on how to treat people. I decided I would correct that instruction quietly and efficiently, and that if it meant a man had to answer for his casual cruelty, then he would learn the cost of cheapening another human. So when people look back and ask, "What did you do?" I say, I protected my dignity so my daughter could keep hers. I used what I had, not to boast, but to build a consequence that fit the harm. 72 hours is a story people like because it sounds like a movie. The truth is, it's more like a careful composition, small moves, patient allies, and a single moment that breaks the illusion someone built. In the end, we returned to a life that looked ordinary. More walks, borrowed cups of coffee, the slow joy of dinners without barbs. The world moves on, and sometimes it does justice without fanfare. But don't ever underestimate the quiet man who keeps a ledger. He remembers how to balance what's owed. When I got home that night, I sat in my recliner, the same one I'd bought 30 years ago, after my wife passed away. It squeaked now when I leaned back, almost like it was sighing with me. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon, something I hadn't done in months. My hands trembled a little as I lifted it, and I stared at my reflection in the glass. Worthless. That word echoed again. But then, a small grin crept onto my face. Because here's the thing about living as long as I have. You stop reacting in anger, and you start responding with purpose. I'd built entire careers by staying calm when everyone else was shouting. People underestimate old men because they think we've slowed down. But I've learned that patience is just strategy in disguise. I put down the glass and opened my laptop. It took a few seconds to boot, an old machine, but dependable, like me. I typed the groom's name into Google. Jason Whitmore. The search results were impressive. CEO of a tech startup, keynote speaker, award recipient. Photos of him in tailored suits, smiling for cameras, standing next to investors. The man was all polish and ego. But I noticed something in one of the news blurbs. His company, FinLogix, had recently secured a massive contract with a government agency. That kind of deal requires background checks, financial integrity, and reputation. And I happen to know a few things about contracts and government audits. You see, before I retired, I'd spent 40 years as a senior compliance officer for the state's procurement department. I'd seen companies rise and fall, many of them because of one missing signature or one dishonest figure in their accounting. I leaned closer to the screen, the bourbon untouched now. Jason had no idea who he'd humiliated that night. No idea that the worthless old man he mocked once had the power to destroy multi-million-dollar deals. And as I scrolled through his LinkedIn page, something sparked in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. I grabbed my old address book, the one with names I hadn't used in years. I called an old friend, Daniel. We'd worked together for 2 decades before retiring. He picked up after the second ring, his voice warm but surprised. "George, it's been ages, man." "Yeah," I said. "You still doing consulting for federal contracts?" He chuckled. "I dabble." "Why, you trying to get back in the game?" "Not quite," I replied, "but I might have something interesting for you to look at." By the next morning, Daniel and I were sitting at a cafe downtown. I slid a printed summary of FinLogix's contract across the table. He raised an eyebrow. "Where did you get this?" Let's just say I still know where to dig, I said with a smile. He scanned the pages, then frowned. This section here, these expense reports, something's off. It looks like they've inflated their R&D costs by at least 15%. If that's true, it's fraud. That word, fraud, sat between us like a loaded gun. Daniel looked at me cautiously. George, what are you planning? I took a slow sip of my coffee. Oh, nothing illegal, just letting the truth do its job. I spent the next 2 days gathering more information. My daughter tried calling once, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not until I'd made my point. She'd chosen him. She'd laughed when he insulted me. Let her see who she really married. By the end of the week, I'd collected everything I needed. Emails, filings, financial disclosures. All public record, all damning if seen together. Then I made one final call to a reporter, a woman named Claire, who used to cover corporate fraud back in my day. Sharp as a tack, never afraid of big names. When she heard Jason's company name, she paused. Finlogics? They've been all over the news lately. I know, I said. That's why you'll want this. I sent her the file, and by Monday morning it was front-page news. Government contractor under investigation for false reporting. The story spread like wildfire. Investors panicked. Clients pulled out. And Jason? He went silent. I didn't have to do much else. The world took care of him. That's the beauty of truth. It doesn't shout. It just waits. 3 days later, I got a call from my daughter. I could hear the tremble in her voice before she spoke. Dad, what did you do? I leaned back in my chair and smiled faintly. Nothing, sweetheart. I just stopped being worthless. But she didn't know that was only phase 1. Because the thing about revenge, it's not just about breaking someone down. It's about reminding them that the people they thought were invisible were watching all along. 3 days turned into a week, and by then, Jason Whitmore's name was everywhere. The headlines got nastier by the hour. Finlogic's CEO accused of misconduct. Government suspends multi-million contract. Shareholders demand resignation. I'd seen this cycle play out dozens of times in my career. When success turns to scandal, the crowd that once cheered you on suddenly can't run away fast enough. And Jason, the man who had called me worthless in front of my family, was now the target of every business blog, every angry investor, every late-night comedian's monologue. Karma, I thought, doesn't need an invitation. It just needs time. I didn't gloat. Not out loud anyway. I just kept to my morning routine, black coffee, newspaper, and a walk around the block. The neighbors waved like usual, unaware that the old man with the cane had just upended a millionaire's empire from his living room. That night, as I sat in my chair, I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, my daughter was standing there, eyes red, makeup smudged. Dad, she said softly, can I come in? For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her, not because of how she looked, but because she sounded like the little girl I used to know, the one who'd ask for bedtime stories and crawl into my lap when thunder scared her. I stepped aside and nodded. Of course, she sat on the couch wringing her hands. He's ruined, Dad. They froze his accounts. He's being investigated. People are calling him a fraud. And? I said quietly. She looked up, eyes pleading. Did you have something to do with it? I smiled faintly. Sweetheart, Jason did that to himself. I just helped the truth find daylight. Her voice cracked. You don't understand, Dad. He could go to jail. We could lose everything. I tilted my head. We? Funny, because a week ago, I wasn't part of your we. That silence between us was thick, heavy enough to choke on. After a long pause, she whispered, I'm sorry for what he said at the wedding. I should have defended you. Should have? I repeated. That's an interesting word. You had 100 guests watching you. You had a choice. You made it. Tears filled her eyes, and I'll admit, part of me wanted to reach out, to hold her hand like I used to when she scraped her knees. But the other part, the one that had spent years being ignored and dismissed, wasn't ready to forgive that easily. She stood up, shaky. I don't know what to do now. I looked at her calm and steady. You start over without him, she frowned. You don't mean that? I met her gaze. I do. And one day, when you're ready to see how blind you were, maybe we can talk again. Until then, learn what kind of man you married, she left quietly. No slamming doors this time. Just the sound of soft footsteps fading into the night. For a few minutes, I sat in silence. Then I opened my laptop again. The screen's glow reflected off the framed photo on my desk. My daughter, 5 years old, smiling with ice cream on her cheeks. I whispered to it, "I didn't want to hurt you, kiddo, but sometimes pain is the only teacher left." Later that week, I got a call from Claire, the reporter. "You might want to see this," she said. "What is it?" "Jason's company filed for bankruptcy. Turns out he'd been funneling money through shell accounts. The feds are all over it." I thanked her, and before hanging up she said, "You were right about him. Guys like that always think they're untouchable, until someone like you comes along." I chuckled. "Well, I've had 70 years to learn how to be patient." That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I destroyed him, but because justice didn't need me to shout. It just needed me to care enough to act. A few days later, an unexpected letter arrived, handwritten, not typed. My daughter's handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Dad, you were right. I see it now. He used me too. I'm staying with Aunt May for a while. I don't expect forgiveness yet, but I want you to know I'm sorry, truly. I love you." I read it 3 times, and by the third my eyes blurred. I placed the note in my desk drawer, next to my wife's photo. Sometimes, I thought, losing everything is how we find our way home, but I wasn't done yet. There was still one last thing I needed to do, one final act to make sure Jason never crawled out of the hole he'd dug. See, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that keeps echoing in the right ears. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Habit, I guess. Old men don't sleep much when the past has too much to say. The air was still, and for a moment I thought about what my daughter's letter meant. Maybe it was the first sign of something healing. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. I poured my coffee, sat by the window, and stared out at the quiet street. I thought I'd feel triumphant now that Jason's empire had collapsed. But what I really felt was peace, not joy, not regret. Just the calm that comes after a long, hard storm. Then my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I answered, "Mr. Carter?" "Yes, this is Agent Morris with the Financial Crimes Division. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Jason Whitmore." I smiled. "I was wondering when you'd call. He came by that afternoon. Polite young man, maybe mid-30s, sharp suit, sharp eyes. The kind of man I used to be before time sanded me down." He sat across from me, recorder on the table. "We've reviewed a series of leaked documents linking Mr. Whitmore's transactions to accounts in the Caymans," he said. "Your name came up as someone who provided information to the press." "Is that correct?" I nodded. "Off the record at the time, yes." He glanced up from his notes. "How did you obtain the files?" I leaned back. Let's just say Jason wasn't as careful as he thought. He once hired a firm I used to consult for. Their servers still had traces of his emails. When I realized what he was doing, the fraud, the kickbacks, I thought someone should know. He paused his recorder. "You understand that this kind of thing could have been risky for you." "At my age?" I chuckled. "Son, I've got more years behind me than ahead. Risk stopped scaring me a long time ago." The agent closed his folder. "You did the right thing, sir. We'll be in touch." As he left, he shook my hand and said something that stuck with me. "Men like you, they remind us that decency doesn't retire." After he drove off, I sat there for a while, staring at the sunlight creeping across the floorboards. My wife used to say, "When the world won't listen, make it impossible for them to ignore you." She was right. By the end of that week, Jason Whitmore was indicted. Embezzlement, tax evasion, securities fraud. The list went on. The man who called me worthless was now being escorted out of his penthouse in handcuffs, surrounded by cameras. I watched it on the evening news, alone in my living room. The reporter's voice was clinical, detached. "Whitmore faces up to 20 years in federal prison." 20 years. Poetic, really. The phone rang again later that night. It was my daughter. "Dad," she said softly, "I saw the news." "I did too." I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I replied. "Just tell me you're all right." "I am," she whispered. "Thanks to you." For the first time in years, I heard her voice crack the way it used to when she was little. That tremble that said, "I need my dad." "Listen," she said, "I'm going to start over. I don't want anything from him, or from what's left of his mess. I just want to rebuild my life." I smiled faintly. "That's the first smart thing I've heard from you in a while," she laughed through her tears. "Maybe I get it from you." After we hung up, I sat back and let the quiet fill the room. There was no more bitterness in me, just an odd kind of gratitude, the kind you feel when the long, hard chapter finally closes. The next morning, I got another call. This one from Claire, the journalist. "You watching the news?" she asked. "I was. You might want to keep watching. He's taking a plea deal." "He's naming names, a lot of them." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean he's turning on his partners?" "Exactly. And you won't believe this. One of those partners just resigned from the same board that pushed you out 30 years ago." I laughed. A deep, honest laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. Full circle. Guess the universe has a sense of humor," she said. "Or maybe just a good memory," I replied. That night, I drove out to the old lake where I used to take my daughter fishing when she was small. The dock was still there, worn, creaking, but steady. I sat on the edge, watching the water shimmer in the moonlight. I took out my phone, scrolled through my photos, and found one from decades ago. Me and my daughter holding a tiny fish, both of us grinning like fools. I hadn't looked at it in years. I whispered, "We'll be okay, kiddo." The stars flickered on the water surface like they were nodding in agreement. As I drove home, the radio played an old Sinatra tune. "The best revenge is massive success." I smiled to myself. Maybe the song had it wrong. The best revenge isn't success. It's peace. It's watching the world try to catch up to the truth you already knew. And maybe, just maybe, it's having your daughter call you Dad again. And mean it. Months passed. Seasons turned and the headlines faded. Jason's name became just another cautionary tale in a long list of men who flew too close to the sun. The trial was swift. The evidence was brutal. He stood there, pale and hollow, while the judge read the sentence, 12 years, no parole. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. I'd already seen everything I needed to see the day he called me worthless. But I did receive one thing, a letter. It arrived in a thin envelope, written in that sharp, controlled handwriting I recognized instantly. "Mr. Carter," it began, "I know I owe you an apology, but I also know you'll never believe it. All I can say is I thought I was untouchable. You proved me wrong. Take care of her. She deserves better than I ever gave her. Jason." I folded it, put it in my drawer, and never read it again. Some ghosts don't deserve to linger. Life settled into something quieter after that. My daughter came by more often. Sometimes she'd bring coffee, sometimes dinner. She started talking about small things again. Her work, her friends, the new place she'd rented. It wasn't like before, but it was enough. One afternoon we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. She turned to me and said, "Dad, when I think about what you did, I still can't believe it." I chuckled. "You mean the part where an old man outsmarted your fancy husband?" She laughed. "No. The part where you forgave me after everything I said." I looked at her, really looked at her, this grown woman who used to ride on my shoulders, who once thought I hung the moon, who later believed a man's money meant more than her father's word. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's about remembering without letting it eat you alive." She nodded, eyes glistening. "You're still teaching me things." "That's what dads do," I said, smiling. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a small business conference. Nothing fancy, just a room full of young entrepreneurs who wanted to hear from an old man who'd been around the block. When I took the stage, I saw curiosity in their faces. One of them asked, "Sir, what's the most important thing you've learned in your career?" I paused, then said, "That the world will try to measure your worth in numbers, your salary, your title, your house. But worth, real worth, is what's left when all of that's gone." The room went quiet. Someone in the back started clapping. Then the rest joined in. I smiled, not because they agreed, but because I finally believed it myself. Later that evening, after the event, I sat alone in the empty hall. My cane rested beside me, my notes folded neatly on the table. I felt content, a word I hadn't truly understood until now. As I got up to leave, a young woman approached me. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. My father passed last year. Hearing your story tonight reminded me that good men still exist. I smiled and patted her shoulder. They do, dear. Sometimes they just get a little quiet with age. When I got home that night, I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, sat by the window, and looked out at the city lights. I thought about how strange it was, how something that began in humiliation had ended in peace. People think revenge is about payback, but they're wrong. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself someone tried to break. It's about standing back up, not to hurt them, but to remind yourself you were never small to begin with. I lifted my glass toward the night and whispered, "Here's to the ones who called us worthless. May they live long enough to see just how wrong they were." Then I laughed quietly to myself, turned off the light, and let the silence settle in, because for the first time in a very long time, I didn't need the world to see me win. I already had.